Welcome back to our study of Leviticus. In this session, we'll be studying Leviticus 18, which in my Bible has the heading Unlawful Sexual Relations, at which point you think, well, this is going to be an interesting experience of Bible reading, and indeed, we'll see if it can be. I would prefer to retitle it Sanctify Your Sex, and I'd like to break it down with you in a few different ways. The first thing I think that will be valuable for us to do is actually to read the beginning and end of this particular text and to notice the framing. After we look at the framing, then we'll look at the specific content of what's in this passage, and then we'll see if we can back up and read the context in such a way that can help us make sense of what this meant then and sense of what it means now. So let me kind of read the kind of preparatory paragraph and then the final paragraph, and then we'll circle back around here in a bit to the laws in between. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord.'" And then we'll flip over and look at the end of the text, looking at verse 24 and following. "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native-born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out, just as it vomited out the nations that were here before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God." That is the framing of the laws that we find in between the opening and the closing paragraph of this first section of what will be a few chapters of various laws about how to live. I'd like to notice three things in particular about the way in which this is framed. I want you to notice, first of all, that we're talking here about who God is. What we're called to do is really a question, first and foremost, of who God is. I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord. Notice the repetition at the beginning and the end of I am the Lord. And it is worth noting that in your English Bibles, if you're looking at those words, you probably see the word Lord is in all capitals. And that's because it's actually the name that God gave Moses at the burning bush. Yahweh, I am Yahweh. So who God is, this God, not just any God, but this God. This is not the general word for God. This is the covenant name for God that God revealed to Moses and his people. This name tells a story. I am the God who brought you up out of Egypt, out of slavery. I am your deliverer, I am your king, I am yours, you are mine. This is who I am. Also, whenever we're looking at the laws, this is something that we'll continue to circle back around to because I want you to remember it. I don't even remember when the first time I was taught it, but I'm grateful for the teachers who told me, is that whenever you're looking at the Old Testament laws, usually you're looking at a precept, which is a specific word for, a particular command. But if you're going to understand it, you need to look beneath the precept to the principle. What is the principle that this law is actually demonstrating? So, don't bear false witness in court. Well, that's the precept. The principle is we can't have a good community if everybody's lying about everybody. And then you dig deeper and you actually find that you're looking at the person of God. The person of God as one who is fundamentally truth actually drives the principle, which gives us the precept. And so it's important to remember that when we look at the laws, we're not just looking at random things that people should and shouldn't do, but something that actually reveals who God is. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is where we are, which is to say, surrounded. I think about in Romans 12, Paul says, don't be conformed to this age. The word means don't be squeezed into a mold by this age. And here you have this call not to live like those who you're surrounded by. And there's even a specific sense to it. I don't want you living like where you came from back in Egypt, and I don't want you living like where you're going to in Canaan. The Lord is always taking us from one place to another place. And he's saying, if you look back, you're not going to find a perfect guide to how to live. If you look forward, you're not going to find a perfect guide to how to live. Don't just do what you see the people around you doing. Do what I have actually commanded you to do. And then the third thing that I want you to see here is that we're talking about how to live. And maybe it's like, well, duh, we're talking about laws. No. Not like just how to behave, but how to live. We're talking about the way to life. And notice what he says whenever he's describing the laws. He says, keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. You will experience life when and as you follow God's decrees and laws. We talk about the Old Testament law, and that's not necessarily the best category. The word for law is Torah, and really it means instructions for life. The words that we have here, decrees and laws, one of them is a little bit more of a legal term, like a stipulation type of word. And the idea is, here's the way in which you regulate your life together. And the other word is one that means like a boundary. But don't go beyond this boundary. It's a word that actually is sometimes used to describe what God does to the ocean. He gives it a boundary and says, you belong here. And we know full well, especially if we live on a coast, if we live near water that sometimes comes too far inland, that water needs to stay in its place. And so God is saying, here are the good wisdom that I'm providing for you so that you might find your proper place, that you might find life. So that's some of the framing that I'm not trying to make anything up, except really just I'm not making anything up, period. What I'm trying to do is to organize some of the thoughts that you see in the way in which Moses frames these particular laws. But he doesn't just frame them, he also gives them the particular laws about sex. And so let's look at the content of these laws. I'm going to jump back into verse 6, where it says, no one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Once again, he says that. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born in the same house or elsewhere. Do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. That would dishonor you. Do not have sexual relations with the daughter of your father's wife, born to your father. She's your sister. Do not have sexual relations with your father's sister. She's your father's close relative. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister, because she is your mother's close relative. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife to have sexual relations. She is your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. That would dishonor your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman, and her daughter. Do not have sexual relations with either her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. They are close relatives. That is wickedness. Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is still living. Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. My word. At least we know that in the ancient world, people were willing to have sex with pretty much whoever was available, similar to ours in some times and places. I'd like to talk about what we see here, and I'd like to make some observations about how we can understand this in a way that, as always, is accurate to the meaning of the text, calls us to account in ways we need to be called to account, but is at least something we can understand as a word from God to us in some way. So I want you to notice, first of all, the obvious detail that you have here is that you're dealing with a lot of do nots. The content of this particular list of instructions is do not, 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 and on down. And here we're connecting the worship of God to sex. There's even some statements about worship specifically, and of course it's framed with an understanding of the God who calls us. It is not odd for religion and sex to become intertwined. Many of the sutras that are famous from Eastern religions have been divorced from their religious context, and now they're just things that people find interesting because they describe various sexual positions and such things. It's fascinating to compare that our actual text of Scripture also has some things to say about sex. And this is not everything the Bible says about sex. Go read Song of Solomon. But this is some of what the Bible says about sex. And in certain respects, if you compare the Kamas, the sutras, the Kama Sutra and other sutras to the Levitical laws, ours seem kind of negative. It's not about, do this and then do that and then do this because you could get certain types of enjoyment from it. It's, well, don't do this and don't do this and don't do this. So they're regulating it in a negative way. And you have to wonder why. Is this because our God is just sort of a killjoy who's not interested in our having fun? Or is it because when you have a valuable do, you need to protect it with appropriate do nots? I think that's actually a relevant thing to see when you're looking at a list of do nots, is that at least some of the time, the list of do nots imply a do. And sometimes the more valuable and powerful and dangerous the do, the more you have to have do nots. So I don't think that it's because God is a killjoy. I think it's because we are to learn certain things about sex that are much deeper than simply how to physically enjoy it. Oh, another thing that I want you to note about the content in that regard is that sex is for marriage. It doesn't come out and use the word marriage very often, but you get the idea that a man is to have sex with his wife and not with all of these other people. And there are some specific sub-themes. There seems to be a sense in which the purpose of sex is oriented to the expansion of families. Most of the laws are, this is a person who is too close to you, and therefore she is off limits to you. So we have this theme of the expansion of human families. Sex is designed for the creation of new families, not just, a bunch of people intermingling within one particular family. You also, of course, probably should have mentioned this even from the start, have the idea of exclusion. This is really, in a way, what drives this, that there are persons with whom you should be able to have sex and should have sex, but there are others with whom you're not. And it is exclusive, specifically a man to his wife and vice versa. Another couple of details that I'd like to mention because, well, one of them's kind of odd, is that you all of a sudden have this weird law about not sacrificing your children to Molech. That seemed to come out of nowhere. And maybe it did come out of nowhere, but let's at least acknowledge that it might be a reminder that when we talk about sex, we're talking about a matter of worship. So this can't just be something that we exclude from our understanding of life with God. It is actually directly related to whether or not we are worshiping Him. And then the last thing I want you to notice is that in this, we see some attention to what we might call the degree of difference. That there, as we talked about here, there needs to be some level of family separation. And then you get toward the end and you see that that the man is not to sleep with another man because that seems to be something that is too similar, but nor is he to have sex with a beast because that's not appropriate for him, nor is it appropriate for a woman to have sex with a beast. And so you've got these various principles. Again, I'm just trying to get our head around the content. So we've got a list of do nots. Do not have sex with all these various people or in all these various ways. And we know that these things are for marriage. It is for the expansion of the family, which means that certain people are off limits. I think this is even related to the one about the woman during her time of her period. You have the exclusive nature of this, you have it being a matter of worship, and you have there being a degree of difference. What do we do with all of this? Well, I would suggest, as always, that you read it in its proper context. That would be the third thing to consider. What is the context that can make sense of these particular teachings on sexuality? And in the context of Leviticus, we are reminded once more that we're talking about God's presence, the presence of a holy God among us. And so the presence of a holy God means holy sex. You might even think this might be a little bit weird, but sex in God's presence is kind of the thrust of what's going on here, that there are appropriate regulations for sex to be managed properly. And these things become very serious when God actually shows up and is here. The other thing that I want you to see about the context of this passage is to recognize that ancient Israelites know what we sometimes forget, which is that while you're reading Leviticus, you certainly never disconnect it or divorce it from the larger context of the Old Testament books, in this case, particularly Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I would suggest to you that you actually have multiple parallels, multiple ideas and overlap that show us that if we're going to understand what's going on in the specific regulations that are being given about sex, we have to keep one eye on Genesis 1 and 2. So that's the context in which we might be able to make sense of some of what we see in this particular passage. Notice some of the elements when it comes to Genesis chapters 1 and 2, the creation of Adam and Eve. One thing that you notice about that particular passage is that you're definitely talking about the importance of an increase. So the first command that is given to Adam and Eve is that they be fruitful and multiply. So they're supposed to make more people. And later on, we find that the husband leaves his father and mother, is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And so the sexual union is about the increase in humans and the increase in families. We also see that here we're talking about imaging God. So it's not just about increasing humans, it's also about imaging God. There in Genesis 1:27, even before you get the command, you have God saying, "Let us make mankind in our own image." And then he did. Image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them, and then he blessed them and gave them the command, be fruitful and increase in number, rule over the world on God's behalf. And so you see there's this idea of increase, which seems to maybe relate to the idea of expansion. Sex is for the expansion of families. You also see that the Adam and Eve are made in such a way that they're for each other and only for each other. This is related to the exclusion thing here, and it's also related to the degree of difference. So in Genesis chapter 2, you kind of back up and you take a slower approach to the creation of mankind, and you have Adam showing up first, and he's experiencing unbroken fellowship with the Father, and he's been given commands, do not eat from the tree, and he's been given work to do, and things seem good except that they're not. Something's not right. He needs a counterpart. He needs a partner. He needs someone to do this with him, and so there's this search for the right counterpart. And first you line up all the animals, and it's like, well, no, the animals aren't going to work because they're like too different. There's not quite a fit. And it can't just be that he needs another version of himself, because the whole point is that it is not good for the man to be alone. He needs, well, we discover he needs woman. And so the woman is the perfect degree of difference from the man in order to bring about this union that increases the human families, makes more babies, and expands the capacity for human beings to rule. I think you get the idea. So you can maybe see some of the connections, but I'm still not sure that we've really seen how all of these things connect. I'm not sure that we've been able to back up yet and get the bigger picture, which is important for us to do. So back up and think about the bigger picture of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, which begins with the creation of a complementary pair, heavens and earth. Heaven being God's realm, God's domain, God's dimension, earth being the physical dimension on which we live. And then you have this initial complementary pair that seems to be in some way related to the other complementary pairs that keep showing up. You've got light and darkness, which become day and night. You've got the land and the sea. You've got fish and fowl. You've got the waters above from the waters below. And so you have all of these pairs that are different, but they work together in harmonious ways to move the mission of creation forward, to display, in a sense, the potential partnership between heaven and earth. And then at the very crown of creation, you have the making of human beings, male and female, who are similar but different. And they're specifically called to image God. And this imaging of God has something to do with their sexual dimorphism, the fact that they're two different versions of the same thing that are able to come together in a way that produces life. How does all of this fit together? All of this fits together when you recognize that imaging God is not just a theoretical thing that humans are supposed to do, but it's intimately connected to the nature of humanity as male and female. That in some way it is the male and female coming together as one that display God's love for that which is different in ways that increase joy and produce new life. That, I think, is the context for understanding both Genesis 1 and 2 and the laws in Leviticus. That God has given sex for marriage, for this one-to-one exclusive union between a man and his wife, between a woman and her husband, and that these two manifest God's love for that which is similar but different. Degree of difference is perfectly appropriate in ways that increase joy. You guys understand the joy that marriage can bring, and produce new life only happens through this type of union. I think part of the point of what we see in Genesis is actually reflected specifically here. That there is a liturgical purpose. There is a symbolic purpose to sex. It's more than just two people making each other feel good. It actually is designed to display very real things about God. It actually, in a way, is a picture of the gospel. That God, though he is in heaven, wants a relationship with us who are on earth. We are similar to him, made in his image, but different. And yet this chasm doesn't have to represent a separation because his love bridges it by drawing us into relationship with him. It is this good news of God's love, which is covenantal, which is ordered, which is purposeful, which is an increase in joy and a producing of new life, that is clearly manifest in sex. That is the reason for the text that we have in Genesis 1 and 2, and that is the reason for the regulations surrounding sex in Leviticus chapter 18. And so we might do well as we think through these various specifics to remember that they are very intentionally framed. The text begins here, and the text circle backs around and ends here. That the regulations, which primarily take the form of do nots, point to a very important do that helps us understand how to live in context where things are done very differently because we are imitating a particular God. This is actually a very beautiful text, even though it seems strange to us. And because Leviticus will talk about sex as we continue, then we will, of course, circle back around to it as well. But I think we've seen enough in this particular passage to raise our thoughts up from simply what happens when the two bodies come together to what the larger picture represents. And so with all these things in mind, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.